There are moments in life when everything seems to come together. Your attention is fully absorbed. You are not fighting yourself. You are not glancing at the clock. You are not replaying old regrets or worrying about what comes next. You are simply inside the activity, fully involved, fully present, and strangely energized by the very effort it requires. A musician feels it while playing. An athlete feels it in motion. A writer feels it in deep concentration. A scientist, a surgeon, a teacher, a craftsman, a chess player, even a child at play can feel it. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi gave this experience a name: flow. In flow, he argues that some of the best moments of life do not come from passive comfort, effortless pleasure, or external reward. They come when our body or mind is stretched in a voluntary effort to accomplish something difficult and worthwhile. This book is not simply about productivity or peak performance. It is about the quality of experience itself. It asks what makes a life feel rich from the inside. It questions the assumption that happiness can be found mainly through favorable circumstances, status, or comfort. And it proposes that fulfillment is deeply connected to the way we organize attention. This is why the book remains so influential. It moves the discussion of happiness away from vague inspiration and into a more exact psychological understanding. It asks us to look closely at our own moments of aliveness. When do we feel most engaged? When does time disappear? When do we feel both challenged and capable? And how might those moments reveal not just isolated pleasures, but a way of living? One of the most important ideas in flow is that the quality of life depends less on external events than we usually think, and more on how those events are experienced. This does not mean circumstances are irrelevant. Poverty, illness, oppression, grief, and instability are real. The book does not deny hardship. But Csikszentmihalyi argues that even when outer conditions matter, they do not fully determine inner life. Two people may live in similar conditions and feel radically different levels of vitality, meaning, and satisfaction. Why? Because consciousness is not simply a mirror of events. It is an active process. What we notice, how we interpret it, what we focus on, what goals we pursue, how we respond to challenge, all of this shapes the lived texture of life. The book suggests that if attention is constantly fragmented, invaded by anxiety, consumed by envy, hijacked by boredom, or scattered by aimless stimulation, then even comfortable lives can feel empty. On the other hand, if attention is directed, gathered, purposeful, and absorbed in meaningful challenges, then life gains depth. This is why Flow is really a book about the management of consciousness. Happiness, in this view, is not something we wait to receive from the world. It is something that emerges when psychic energy is invested well. The question becomes not only what do I have, but what do I do with my attention? Not only what happens to me, but what structure does my experience take? That shift changes the entire conversation about fulfillment. A subtle but essential distinction in the book is the difference between pleasure and enjoyment. Pleasure is immediate and often restorative. Eating when hungry, resting when tired, receiving praise, feeling warm after being cold, escaping stress for a moment, all of these may feel pleasant. Pleasure has value. It is part of being human. But pleasure alone does not necessarily build a satisfying life. It often passes quickly and leaves the self unchanged. Enjoyment is something deeper. Enjoyment tends to occur when we extend ourselves, use our capacities, and meet a challenge in a skillful way. It involves effort, concentration, and growth. When we experience enjoyment, we do not just feel good in the moment. We feel enlarged by the experience. We become more complex, more capable, more alive. Csikszentmihalyi wants readers to see that many modern habits overvalue pleasure and undervalue enjoyment. We seek relief, stimulation, and ease, but often neglect the activities that create lasting engagement. The result can be a strangely comfortable dissatisfaction. We may have more convenience than ever and yet feel distracted, restless, and undernourished. The book offers a corrective. It says the richest life is not one with the fewest demands, but one with the most meaningful forms of involvement. And that is exactly where flow begins. Flow is Csikszentmihalyi's term for optimal experience, the state in which people are so involved in an activity that nothing else seems to matter. The activity becomes rewarding in itself. A person in flow is not merely busy. They are deeply absorbed. Attention is fully invested in the task. Action and awareness begin to merge. Instead of standing outside the activity and monitoring every move, the person becomes one with the process. There is often a sense of clarity. Goals are apparent. Feedback is immediate. One knows what to do next and can adjust in real time. Self-consciousness diminishes. The mind is no longer preoccupied with how one appears, whether one is being judged, or what this moment says about identity. Time may seem altered. Hours pass like minutes, or a brief period becomes strangely expansive. Perhaps most importantly, the challenge of the activity is balanced with the person's skill. It is demanding enough to require focus, but not so overwhelming that it collapses into panic. This balance is central. Too little challenge produces boredom. Too much challenge produces anxiety. Flow arises in the dynamic middle where difficulty calls forth ability. The experience feels active, energized, and coherent. Many people recognize this immediately because they have known it before, even if they did not have a name for it. The genius of the book is that it takes this familiar but elusive feeling and shows it not as an accident, but as a pattern. Csikszentmihalyi identifies several recurring conditions that support flow. First, there are clear goals. The person knows what they are trying to do, even if the overall project is large or open-ended. Second, there is immediate feedback. The activity itself tells you whether you are moving well or poorly, whether you are solving the problem or missing something. Third, challenge and skill are held in balance. This means not only choosing the right task, but also developing oneself so that more demanding tasks become engaging instead of frightening. Fourth, concentration becomes possible because distractions are reduced and the mind has a reason to stay focused. Fifth, there is a sense of control. Not total domination over events, but enough responsiveness that the person feels able to meet what is happening. Sixth, self-consciousness fades. One is not endlessly performing for an inner audience. Finally, the activity becomes autotelic, meaningful in itself. These conditions are simple to describe, but they are transformative in practice. They explain why some activities become compulsively engaging in a healthy way, while others leave us emotionally flat. They also explain why flow does not depend on the social prestige of an activity. Painting, gardening, coding, conversation, sports, carpentry, mathematics, cooking, research, teaching, climbing, and music can all become flow activities if they contain these structural features. The lesson is powerful. Fulfillment is less about the label on the activity and more about the form of experience it invites. To understand why flow feels so good, the book invites us to consider what consciousness feels like when it is not ordered. Much of ordinary life is spent in a kind of mental fragmentation. Attention is pulled in too many directions. A worry interrupts concentration. A comparison interrupts gratitude. A resentment colors perception. Boredom flattens the present. Fear fills the mind with rehearsed catastrophes. Csikszentmihalyi uses the idea of psychic entropy to describe this condition. Entropy here means disorder in consciousness, a state in which attention is no longer available for purposeful action because it has been captured by internal noise. When this happens, life can feel exhausting even when nothing dramatic is wrong. We are not fully available to the world because too much energy is being spent on scattered thought. Flow is the opposite. It is a condition of psychic order. Attention is not torn apart, it is unified. Instead of battling ourselves, we become available to the task. Instead of being divided among impulses, worries, and distractions, we feel gathered. This is one reason flow is so restorative. It is effortful, but it is not wasteful. The energy we spend creates coherence rather than confusion. That is a striking insight. Many people assume that relaxation is always the cure for stress. But the book shows that deep engagement can be just as healing, sometimes more so, because it reorganizes attention into a more harmonious pattern. In flow, we are not simply escaping life. We are meeting it in a form that brings order. One of the most memorable ideas in flow is that boredom and anxiety are not random moods, but signals of imbalance. When challenge falls below our ability, attention collapses. We become underused, uninterested, and detached. When challenge rises too far above our ability, attention can flood with fear. We feel overwhelmed, threatened, and tempted to withdraw. Growth happens in the territory between these two extremes. This is where the activity is difficult enough to matter, but not so difficult that it becomes chaos. That middle zone is where flow is most likely to appear. The implications are practical. If you are bored, it may not mean the activity has no value. It may mean you need to raise the challenge, refine the goal, or deepen your skill. If you are anxious, it may not mean you should quit. It may mean the challenge needs to be broken down or your skill needs development. The point is not to remain perpetually comfortable. The point is to keep adjusting until difficulty becomes engaging rather than defeating. In this sense, a meaningful life is dynamic. It requires ongoing calibration. We are always learning how to stretch without snapping and how to stay awake rather than drift into passivity. A central word in the book is autotelic. It refers to an activity done for its own sake. The reward is not merely external. It lies in the doing itself. This concept is one of the deepest in the entire work because it challenges a highly instrumental view of life. Many people are trained to think in terms of outcomes only. Work for money. Study for grades. Exercise for appearance. Read for status. Create for approval. Strive for recognition. Csikszentmihalyi does not deny the reality of external rewards, but he insists that the best forms of life cannot be organized entirely around them. When an activity becomes autotelic, the process itself becomes meaningful. We do it not only to get somewhere else, but because this form of engagement is itself worth inhabiting. That is why flow often feels pure. It temporarily frees us from the endless chain of means and ends. We are not always asking what comes after this. We are in this. This idea changes the way we think about success. A life built only around external markers can remain hollow even when those markers are achieved. A life with autotelic depth, by contrast, contains richness in the very structure of action. It turns living from a constant deferred arrival into a series of meaningful participations. Flow is often associated with creative or intellectual work, but Csikszentmihalyi also pays close attention to the body. Physical movement can become one of the most direct pathways into optimal experience. Sports, dance, hiking, swimming, martial arts, yoga, skilled labor, even rhythmic walking can produce deep engagement when they involve discipline, challenge, and concentration. This matters because the body is not merely a biological machine carrying the mind around. It is one of the primary ways we encounter the world. When physical skill develops, the range of possible experience expands. A trained body can participate in more refined forms of attention. It can respond with grace rather than clumsiness, presence rather than dullness. The body's capacities become a source of enjoyment, not just maintenance. The book suggests that many people live in partial exile from this kind of experience. They either neglect the body or treat it only as an object to improve aesthetically. Flow offers a richer possibility. The body can become a site of aliveness, challenge, and meaning. When movement and attention come together, the person often feels both powerful and peaceful. There is no extra commentary needed. The act itself becomes complete enough. Just as the body can enter flow, so can the mind. One of the pleasures of the book is its respect for intellectual life as a source of enjoyment rather than mere obligation. Reading, writing, solving problems, studying, researching, imagining, and reflecting can all become deeply satisfying when they are approached with discipline and curiosity. But this kind of mental flow rarely appears in a passive or scattered state. It requires attention to be trained. The modern mind is often interrupted before it can gather momentum. Notifications, fragmented schedules, ambient distraction, and internal restlessness make deep thought harder to sustain. Csikszentmihalyi's work reminds us that thinking can itself be a craft. When the mind learns to hold a question, trace an argument, follow a pattern, or create something coherent, it enters a different quality of experience. Thought ceases to be a constant chatter and becomes a medium of exploration. This is why the book places such emphasis on the ordering of consciousness. A neglected mind may remain vulnerable to boredom because it lacks inner resources. A cultivated mind can generate complexity, interest, and joy from within. Solitude becomes less threatening. Silence becomes less empty. The person develops an interior life rich enough to sustain attention rather than merely escape from emptiness. One of the more surprising arguments in flow is that work often provides more opportunities for engagement than leisure does. Many people imagine that freedom begins when work ends. They endure their tasks and wait for the evening, the weekend, the vacation, the retirement, the someday when real life will begin. Csikszentmihalyi complicates this assumption. Work, at its best, offers goals, structure, feedback, increasing complexity, and the chance to develop skill. These are exactly the conditions that support flow. Leisure, by contrast, easily becomes passive if it centers only on consumption. A person can spend hours on entertainment and still feel strangely unsatisfied because passive diversion does not automatically produce involvement. The book does not romanticize all work. Some jobs are genuinely dehumanizing, repetitive, or constrained. But even within limits, the way a person approaches work can change experience. Small elements of autonomy, craftsmanship, care, learning, and challenge can alter the structure of attention. The larger message is that fulfillment does not come simply from escaping demands. It comes from demands that are meaningful, skill-building, and inhabitable. That has implications far beyond employment. It suggests that we should not ask only how to reduce effort, but how to shape effort into something worthy of our attention. If work can become engaging, why does leisure so often fail to satisfy? Csikszentmihalyi suggests that many forms of modern leisure are organized around passive consumption rather than active participation. We watch, scroll, absorb, and drift. These activities can relax us temporarily, but they often do not gather attention in the way flow does. They may numb boredom without replacing it with engagement. This is one of the most relevant insights in the book. A life full of stimulation can still feel empty if attention is never asked to become skillful, purposeful, and absorbed. The solution is not to eliminate pleasure or entertainment. It is to build active forms of leisure into life. Music, hiking, cooking, reading with intensity, gardening, conversation, drawing, games of skill, making things, learning languages, volunteering, and creative hobbies can all become sources of autotelic enjoyment. The issue is not whether leisure exists. The issue is whether it is shaped in a way that develops the self or merely distracts it. The book gently but firmly pushes readers to become creators of experience rather than just recipients of stimuli. Flow is often described as an individual state, but the book also explores how relationships can deepen or diminish the quality of experience. Conversation can become rewarding when it contains real attention, challenge, play, responsiveness, and mutual investment. Friendship, love, parenting, and collaborative work all contain the potential for flow when people are genuinely present to one another. Shared activity can focus consciousness in powerful ways. At the same time, The book gives surprising dignity to solitude. A person who cannot be alone without turning to distraction remains fragile. If silence immediately becomes boredom, then consciousness is still underdeveloped. One of the marks of a rich life is the ability to turn solitude into a space of reflection, creativity, and inward freedom. That does not mean isolation. It means that attention is no longer entirely dependent on external novelty. The person can generate order, meaning, and involvement from within. This balance between connection and solitude is one of the book's quiet strengths. It suggests that the best lives are neither socially frantic nor emotionally withdrawn, but capable of depth in both shared and solitary experience. Toward the deeper end of the book, Csikszentmihalyi describes what he calls the autotelic personality. This is not a rigid personality type, but a way of approaching life. Autotelic people are more likely to transform circumstances into opportunities for involvement. They are curious, attentive, and willing to engage with challenge. They do not need every condition to be perfect before interest begins. They know how to notice possibilities for skill, meaning, and order even in modest situations. This idea matters because it shows that flow is not just about finding the right activity. It is also about developing the right habits of consciousness. A person can move through an interesting life and remain disengaged. Another can meet ordinary tasks with depth and vitality. The difference lies partly in cultivated inner capacities, concentration, resilience, curiosity, and the ability to frame difficulty as invitation rather than only threat. This is one reason the book is ultimately hopeful. It does not say fulfillment belongs only to the naturally gifted or the externally fortunate. It says some of the most important conditions of meaning can be learned. The later sections of Flow broaden the discussion into a philosophy of life. Flow is not presented merely as a series of enjoyable moments. It becomes part of a larger question: how do human beings create meaning under conditions of uncertainty, suffering, and disorder? Life contains loss, randomness, frustration, and limitation. No psychological theory worth keeping can pretend otherwise. Csikszentmihalyi's answer is not to seek permanent comfort. It is to build complexity in the self by repeatedly transforming challenge into conscious order. Over time, this creates a life that feels more coherent. Meaning is not handed to us. It is assembled through sustained participation in worthy goals. Flow experiences matter because they train us in this art. They teach us how to direct attention rather than surrender it, how to remain engaged rather than collapse into passivity, how to find structure where chaos might otherwise dominate. The phrase cheating chaos captures this beautifully. We do not abolish the unpredictability of life. We learn how to meet it with a more organized consciousness. In that sense, flow is both psychological and existential. It is a way of living that resists dissolution. It gathers life into forms that feel purposeful and alive. The most useful books change how we live ordinary hours, and Flow certainly does that. Its practical lessons are wide-ranging. Choose activities that require real participation, not just passive exposure. Break large ambitions into clear goals so that progress becomes legible. Seek feedback, whether through mentors, systems, measurement, or the activity itself. Notice the point at which boredom appears and ask whether the challenge needs to rise. Notice the point at which anxiety becomes paralyzing and ask whether the challenge must be divided into smaller steps or your skills strengthened. Protect concentration. Make time for uninterrupted work and equally intentional forms of leisure. Train the body. Train the mind. Build hobbies that develop rather than merely distract. Learn to value the process itself, not only the reward waiting at the end. Perhaps most importantly, treat attention as one of your most precious resources. What you repeatedly give attention to becomes the architecture of your days and eventually of your life. This is why the book still feels urgent. In an age of interruption, it reminds us that fulfillment depends on the quality of our participation. We do not stumble into rich experience by accident. We shape it by how we attend, what we practice, and what we choose to be absorbed by. By the end of Flow, the reader is left with a surprisingly elegant vision of human flourishing. Happiness is not merely pleasure. It is not simply luck. It is not secured once and for all by achievement, comfort, or status. It grows out of how we meet experience. The best moments in life are often not those in which we receive something effortlessly, but those in which we bring ourselves fully to a meaningful challenge. Flow names those moments, but it also points beyond them. It suggests a way of organizing life so that attention becomes more disciplined, consciousness more ordered, and experience more alive. This is a demanding idea because it places responsibility back in our hands. But it is also liberating because it means fulfillment is not entirely at the mercy of circumstance. We can learn to cultivate activities, habits, and forms of perception that make life richer from within. We can build days that contain more depth, not by chasing constant pleasure, but by becoming more fully engaged. And that may be the deepest gift of this book. It teaches that a meaningful life is not found mainly in what we own, display, or consume. It is found in the moments when we are wholly present to what we are doing, stretched by it, shaped by it, and quietly transformed by the experience itself.